taking a beating for engaging in trying to solve hard problems like immigration in a very red state. I think the fact that I'm not married, America can handle it. I sure can handle it.
Well, cheers to that.
For 4 decades, Lindsey Graham stood in front of cameras, courtrooms, and campaign crowds as one of the most recognizable senators in America. And he did it all without a wife ever standing beside him. People whispered about it for years. Reporters tiptoed around it in interviews. Opponents used it against him. But now, in the days following his sudden death, the one person who actually knows the truth is finally speaking. His younger sister, the woman he raised, adopted, and protected since she was a teenager, has laid out exactly why marriage never happened for Lindsey Graham. And the real answer has nothing to do with the rumors that followed him through Washington for 20 years. It has everything to do with a promise he made in a living room in central South Carolina when he was barely out of his teens himself. The room behind the bar. Before there was a senator, before there was a presidential candidate, before there was a man Donald Trump would call one of his closest allies in Washington, there was just a boy named Lindsey and his little sister Darlene, growing up in a town so small most Americans couldn't find it on a map. Central South Carolina, a mill town outside Clemson. And the Graham family didn't just live in Central, they lived inside their own business. Their parents, Millie and F.J. Graham, ran a combination restaurant, bar, and pool hall known as the Sanitary Cafe. For years, the family's actual living quarters were a single room tucked behind that business. Think about that for a second. No separate house, no backyard, just one room behind a bar where 2 parents raised 2 kids while running a small-town business 7 days a week. Lindsey talked about it publicly for years. The pool hall, the bar stools, the sound of the cafe still going, while the family tried to sleep just a wall away. It wasn't a hidden or shameful part of his story. If anything, he leaned into it, using it later in his career as proof that he understood working-class struggle from the inside, not from a textbook. It's the kind of upbringing that either breaks people or builds something unshakable in them. For Lindsey Graham, it built the second thing, because everything that would come later, the guardianship, the sacrifice, the decision that would define the rest of his personal life, traces back to that one room behind the Sanitary Cafe. It's also worth noting just how ordinary that life looked from the outside, at least at first. FJ and Millie Graham weren't struggling in some dramatic headline-making way. They were simply working-class parents running a small business in a small southern town, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody and nobody thought twice about a family living behind their own storefront. Lindsey has described those early years with genuine fondness rather than resentment, crediting that upbringing with the work ethic that carried him through law school, the Air Force, and eventually the United States Senate. There was no sign in those early years of the tragedy that was about to reshape the entire family within just a few short years. Darlene was the baby of the family. Lindsey was older, already carving out his own path, already dreaming about law school and a life outside Central. Neither of them had any idea that within just a few years, the safety net underneath both of them would be gone entirely, and that the 8 or 9 years separating brother and sister would suddenly stop mattering at all. So how does a childhood spent living behind a bar turn into one of the most quietly devastating family stories in modern American politics? It starts with a diagnosis nobody saw coming. The year everything fell apart. Here's where the story stops being a simple small-town biography and turns into something much heavier. While Lindsey was away at school, his mother, Millie, was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. It's a form of cancer that today has far better survival rates than it did back then, but in the 1970s, in a small South Carolina town, it was often a death sentence. Millie Graham died at the age of 52. The timing was almost cruel. She was buried the day before Darlene turned 12 years old. Imagine that. A young girl, about to become a teenager, standing at her own mother's funeral instead of celebrating a birthday with cake and friends. If that had been the only tragedy, it would already be one of the harder family stories you'd hear from a politician's childhood. But it wasn't the only one. Roughly 15 months later, barely more than a year, their father suffered a massive heart attack, and it was 13-year-old Darlene who found him. She had gone to wake him up for school and instead discovered that their father had died in his sleep. Darlene has spoken about that morning in interviews over the years, describing the fear of standing in the living room of their house, feeling like her entire world had collapsed for the second time in barely a year. She's recalled Lindsey wrapping his arms around her in that moment and making her a promise that he was going to take care of her, that he was going to always be there for her, no matter what. At the time, Lindsey wasn't a senator. He wasn't even a lawyer yet. He was a college student in his early 20s. Suddenly, the only adult a 13-year-old girl had left in the world. No extended family stepped in to formally raise her instead. No court had to force his hand. It was simply understood from that moment forward that Lindsey was her guardian. It's worth sitting with just how much was riding on that decision. Most 20-something college students are still figuring out who they are, let alone taking financial and emotional responsibility for a grieving teenager. There was no guidebook for what Lindsey was about to do, no obvious model in his own life for how to be both a college student, chasing a law degree, and a stand-in parent at the same time. He simply decided that was who he was going to be, and then spent the rest of his life proving he meant it. So what does a 20-something college kid do when he suddenly becomes the only parent his teenage sister has? For Lindsey Graham, the answer wasn't complicated at all, but it would shape every decision he made for the rest of his life. The weekend commute. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into the campaign ads, but it's arguably the most telling detail of all. After their father's death, Darlene didn't move in with Lindsey directly. She lived with relatives nearby in the town of Seneca, while Lindsey pushed forward with law school in Columbia. But living with relatives didn't mean Lindsey stepped back. According to Lindsey's own law school roommate, who later spoke to NPR about those years, Lindsey made the drive home to check on his sister almost every single weekend. He wasn't just checking in for a quick visit either. He was keeping tabs on her curfew, making sure he knew who her friends were, acting in every functional sense, like a parent, while he was still a law student himself, trying to build the career that would eventually take him all the way to Washington. Picture that schedule: classes and coursework during the week in Columbia. Then, weekend after weekend, driving back to Seneca to make sure his little sister was safe, staying on top of her homework, staying out of trouble, showing up at whatever school event a 13 or 14-year-old needed a guardian at. Most 20-something law students in that era were focused on studying, socializing, figuring out their own futures, maybe dating someone seriously for the first time. Lindsey Graham was doing all of that while functioning as a long-distance parent to a grieving teenager 2 towns away. Darlene has said publicly that there was never any doubt in her mind, or in anyone else's mind, that Lindsey was her guardian in every sense of the word. Not just legally, but emotionally, from the very beginning. Not an occasional presence, not a relative who checked in when convenient. A constant. It's the kind of detail that gets lost in a 30-second campaign ad, but says everything about who Lindsey actually was underneath the politics. A law student with every reason to focus entirely on himself, instead chose, weekend after weekend, to make a several-hour round trip so a teenage girl wouldn't feel abandoned. Nobody was forcing him to do it. There was no custody arrangement mandating those visits, no judge checking in to make sure he showed up. He showed up because he'd made a promise, and because showing up was simply who he decided to be. And that word, guardian, wasn't just a figure of speech. It was about to become an actual, legal reality. The adoption nobody talks about. Here's the detail that genuinely surprises most people who only know Lindsey Graham from cable news segments and Senate hearings. After their father's death, Lindsey didn't just informally look after Darlene. He became her legal guardian. And then, once he joined the United States Air Force as a military lawyer, he took it a step further. He formally adopted his own sister. The reasoning was practical and, honestly, kind of heartbreaking. As a member of the military, Lindsey had access to certain benefits, and by legally adopting Darlene, those benefits could pass directly to her if anything ever happened to him. Think about the level of foresight and responsibility that decision required. This wasn't a spontaneous, emotional gesture made in a moment of grief. It was a young Air Force officer sitting down, thinking through worst-case scenarios most people that age never even consider, and then rearranging his own legal identity to make sure his teenage sister would always be protected, no matter what happened to him. Lindsey went on to build a career in the Air Force and the Air Force Reserves that spanned decades, eventually retiring as a colonel around 2015, right around the time he launched his first run for president. But that adoption, made decades earlier, is really the origin point of everything that came next. The reason a United States senator would spend the next 40 years of his life without a wife or children of his own. Because once you become a parent, legally, financially, emotionally, at barely 20 years old, that responsibility doesn't just fade away when your sister grows up, gets married, and starts a family of her own. It becomes part of who you are. It reshapes what family even means to you for the rest of your life. So if Lindsey Graham had already built a family with his sister by the time he was in his 20s, why did the marriage question keep following him for the rest of his career, decade after decade? That's exactly what his sister has now addressed directly. Why he never married. This is the heart of the story, the part everyone actually clicked on this video for. For years, the fact that Lindsey Graham never married became one of the most speculated about aspects of his entire public life. Political opponents whispered about it, tabloids danced around it, late-night hosts joked about it, and Graham himself was asked about it, directly and indirectly, more times than probably any other senator in modern history. It followed him through 2 presidential runs, through decades in the Senate, through every campaign cycle in South Carolina. His own answer, laid out years ago in his memoir, My Story, was simple on the surface. He attributed it largely to timing, suggesting that the right opportunity or the right person never quite lined up at the right moment in his life. He even joked, self-deprecatingly, that he hadn't been especially lucky in that department, but timing is doing a lot of quiet, heavy lifting in that explanation. And that's exactly where Darlene's account fills in the picture that Lindsey himself only ever gestured at from a distance. According to Darlene, the real story isn't about bad luck or missed opportunities in the way most people experience them. It's about a man who, at the exact age when most people are focused on building their own romantic lives, was instead focused on keeping a promise to a grieving 13-year-old. While his peers were dating, getting engaged, and starting families of their own in their 20s, Lindsey was driving back to Seneca every single weekend to check on his sister's curfew, while other young lawyers were building their personal lives alongside their careers. Lindsey was legally adopting his own sibling to protect her financial future in case anything happened to him. By the time Darlene was grown, married, and starting a family of her own, Lindsey's entire adult identity had already been built around a different kind of family unit, the sister he'd raised, and later the Senate and the military. He did come close to marriage once, a detail he revealed himself in his memoir, though he never went into extensive detail publicly about who that almost relationship involved, or what ultimately happened. But the broader pattern Darlene describes, and the pattern that shows up again and again across decades of interviews and campaign appearances, is consistent. A life where family obligation and public service repeatedly took priority over building a household of his own. It's worth being clear about what this story is not. It is not a story about scandal, and it is not a story about hidden secrets, whatever the tabloids spent years speculating. It's a story about a young man who lost both of his parents within about 15 months of each other, made an immediate and lasting decision to raise his teenage sister, and then simply never stopped prioritizing that responsibility for the rest of his life, even as the country around him kept inventing its own explanations. And that's really the frustrating part, if you think about it from Darlene's perspective. For 20 years, Strangers online and on cable news speculated wildly about why her brother never married, filling in the blanks with whatever theory suited their politics. Meanwhile, the actual answer was sitting in plain sight the entire time, in the interviews Darlene herself had already given, in the memoir Lindsey himself had already written, in the weekend drives to Seneca that his own law school roommate had already described publicly. It was never really a secret. It just wasn't the answer people wanted, because it wasn't scandalous enough to spread. So once Darlene became an adult with her own family, did that bond between brother and sister fade the way so many childhood relationships do once life pulls people in different directions? Not even close. The bond that followed him to Washington. If you followed Lindsey Graham's political career at all over the past 2 decades, you may have noticed a recurring figure standing near him at some of his biggest moments. And it wasn't a spouse. It was Darlene. Without a wife by his side, Graham consistently brought his sister into the spotlight of his political life in a way that few senators do with siblings. She appeared at campaign events. She introduced him to crowds. She gave interviews about their childhood, painting a softer, more personal picture of a man most of the country only knew as a sharp-tongued senator and cable news fixture. A fixture who logged dozens of appearances on Sunday political shows over the years and became one of the most quoted lawmakers in Washington. One of the most striking moments came in June of 2015. When Lindsey launched his campaign for president in his hometown of Central. The day before that announcement, Darlene reportedly walked into the old pool room behind their childhood home for the first time in roughly 3 decades, and she cried. On the way to the announcement itself, brother and sister stopped together at their parents' graves before Lindsey stepped onto that stage and told the crowd that no one, including him, ever expected to hear him say he was running for President of the United States. During that same campaign, Darlene appeared in a campaign ad describing exactly what Lindsey had meant to her growing up, helping her with homework, giving her medicine when she was sick, teaching her how to ride a bicycle. Small, ordinary moments that, given everything the family had been through, carried an enormous amount of weight on camera. She's summed up their relationship simply and consistently over the years, that she always looked up to him, that he was always there for her, that if she ever fell down and scraped her knee, he was the person she ran to. Not a parent in the traditional sense, not exactly an older sibling either. Something in between, forged by tragedy and cemented by more than 4 decades of consistency. And that consistency didn't stop as Lindsey's political career grew larger and more national. Even in his final months, as he ran for a 5th Senate term, Darlene was reportedly by his side as he filed his re-election paperwork, along with her own children and grandchildren. A genuine 3-generation family, standing behind a man the country often saw as a solitary political operator with no family of his own at all. Which brings us to another question worth asking. If Lindsey never built a family of his own in the traditional sense, did he ever find anything close to it inside the walls of the Senate itself? Once you start looking closely at Lindsey Graham's decades in Washington, you'll see that the man built an entire second family out of his colleagues, and he did it across party lines in a way that's genuinely rare in modern politics. The most famous example is his friendship with the late Senator John McCain of Arizona. For years, the two men were practically inseparable on the world stage, showing up together at press conferences from Kabul to Munich, standing shoulder to shoulder on foreign policy positions that often put them at odds with their own party. Alongside Senator Joe Lieberman of Connecticut, the 3 men became known in Washington as a kind of unofficial trio, traveling together, appearing together, arguing together, and defending each other publicly more often than not. When McCain passed away, those close to Graham described a visible, lasting change in him, the loss of someone who had functioned almost like an older brother inside the institution where Graham spent most of his adult life. It's not hard to see the pattern once you know the rest of his story. A man who lost his parents as a young adult and built a substitute family around his sister didn't stop building substitute families once he got to Washington. He just did it with senators instead. That pattern extended beyond his ideological allies, too. Illinois Senator Dick Durbin, a Democrat who disagreed with Graham on plenty of major issues, has spoken about traveling with him on a NATO delegation trip in Graham's final week alive, describing him as constantly working the room, sitting down with anyone who would listen about how to bring the war in Ukraine closer to an end. Durbin has also pointed to their work together on immigration reform over the years as proof that Graham could be both a fierce partisan and a genuine bipartisan partner, someone who disagreed intensely on policy without ever letting it curdle into personal animosity. It paints a picture of a man who denied the traditional nuclear family most people build in their 20s and 30s, spent the rest of his life quietly assembling family in every other place he could find it. A sister he adopted, a best friend in the Senate he traveled the world with, and a rotating cast of colleagues on both sides of the aisle who considered him someone you could have a real relationship with even when you disagreed on almost everything. So with all of that context, the childhood tragedy, the adopted sister, the Senate brotherhood, how did all of it collide in the final days of his life? That's where the story takes its most sudden turn. To understand just how sudden this ending really was, it helps to know what Lindsey Graham was doing in his final days. Just before his death, Graham had traveled overseas to Ukraine, where he met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, a trip consistent with the foreign policy focus that had defined much of his later Senate career, particularly his outspoken support for Ukraine and Israel. He had also recently attended a NATO summit, where colleagues described him working the room relentlessly, pushing his views on how to bring the war closer to an end. By Saturday night, he was back home in Washington. According to Trump, the two men spoke by phone that evening, hours before Graham died. Trump later said that, other than sounding tired, Graham seemed completely fine on that call. He was scheduled to appear on a major Sunday political broadcast the very next morning, a show he had appeared on more than 60 times over the course of his career. Instead, in the early hours of Sunday, his office confirmed that he had died from a brief and sudden illness. A preliminary medical finding pointed to an aortic dissection tied to underlying heart disease, a tear in the body's main artery, more common in men in their 60s and 70s, that can turn fatal within hours if untreated. He was 71 years old. The tributes that followed came from every corner of government and from world leaders alike, a testament to just how far his influence had reached beyond South Carolina. Senate leadership called him a fierce advocate for the country. Foreign leaders in Ukraine and Israel released statements mourning the loss of a steadfast ally. Colleagues across the political aisle, including some who disagreed with him constantly, described him as a man who never let policy disagreements turn personal. But in the middle of all those official statements and diplomatic tributes, the person the cameras kept returning to was Darlene. Full circle. In the chaos and grief that followed Graham's death, one name kept surfacing again and again as Republican leaders scrambled to fill his vacant Senate seat. Darlene. President Trump publicly recommended that South Carolina's governor appoint her to serve out the remainder of her brother's term, calling it a fitting tribute to a man he described as one of the greatest people and senators he had ever known. South Carolina's other sitting senator, Tim Scott, backed the pick within hours, saying publicly that after speaking with Darlene directly, there was no one better who understood how much Lindsey loved his family, his state, and his country. Senate leadership echoed the sentiment, framing her appointment as a natural extension of Lindsey's legacy rather than a political consolation prize, with the Senate Majority Leader saying publicly that it made a lot of sense given everything the two siblings had built together. And in the end, that's exactly what happened. South Carolina's governor formally appointed Darlene Graham Nordone to finish out her brother's Senate term, which runs through early January. At the announcement, the governor put it plainly that Lindsey had spent years taking care of his little sister, and now it was time for her to finish his work for him. Darlene herself responded with a line that, given everything this family has been through, lands with enormous weight. That Lindsey had always been there for her, and now she would be there for him. She is expected to be formally sworn into the Senate within days of her appointment, officially completing a journey that began the moment her brother first promised, as a scared 13-year-old stood in their living room, that he would never leave her to face life alone. It's an almost unbelievable turn of events when you step back and look at the full arc of this family's story. A 13-year-old girl who lost both of her parents within about 15 months. A college-aged brother who put his own personal life on indefinite hold to raise her. Decades of a bond built on weekend visits, a legal adoption, campaign trail appearances, and a promise made in a living room long before either of them had any idea where life would eventually take them. And now, in the most unexpected way imaginable, that promise has come full circle, with the sister he raised carrying his legacy forward in the very institution where he spent nearly a quarter-century of his life. Darlene Graham Nordone will serve in the United States Senate through at least the start of January, when the next Congress convenes, before South Carolina voters decide who holds the seat for a full term. But regardless of how long she ultimately stays in Washington, she's already made history in a deeply personal way, becoming, in a sense, the final chapter in a story that started with two grieving kids in a small room behind a bar in central South Carolina nearly 50 years ago. Lindsey Graham's public life was defined by headlines, hearings, and heated political battles. But according to the person who knew him longest and best, the real story of why he never married was never a mystery at all. And it definitely wasn't scandalous. It was a choice he made at barely 20 years old and never once walked back for the rest of his life. It's easy to reduce politicians to their sound bites and their votes, but underneath all of that, Lindsey Graham was also just a young man who kept a promise to his little sister for over 40 straight years, right up until the very end. In the end, the story people spent decades trying to complicate turned out to be remarkably simple. Behind the headlines, campaign speeches, and endless speculation was a brother who chose responsibility over everything else. While millions debated his personal life from a distance, the people closest to him already knew the truth. His greatest commitment wasn't to clearing up rumors or proving strangers wrong. It was to keeping a promise made to a frightened 13-year-old girl who had just lost everything. Sometimes the truth isn't buried beneath secrets at all. It's simply overshadowed by the stories people find more entertaining to believe. If this story moved you, make sure you hit subscribe, because we've got more untold family stories behind the political headlines coming your way. Drop a comment below and let us know what part of Lindsey and Darlene's story surprised you the most. We'll see you in the next one.